So the topic, like I said today, is structuring business ownership. And to me, structuring business ownership involves two things essentially, and that is selecting the legal entity that makes the most sense for you with your particular situation, and also selecting the best tax classification for you for your particular situation. So here are the legal entity options, and these are probably very familiar. You've probably at least seen these before. The corporation, the limited liability company, the partnership, limited partnership, the limited liability partnership, and this one's a mouthful, that limited liability limited partnership. So how are we going to choose the best entity for you? Generally, the best way to do that is to take a look at the attributes of each entity and then compare them with the other entities that we talked about. So the attributes that are important in making a decision are liability protection, the management structure, governance requirements, whether they're good for raising capital, and some tax differences. So liability protection, this is the main reason why business entities are formed, is to give the shareholders or the owners protection from the liabilities of the entity. In a corporation, the shareholders are certainly shielded from liabilities of the entity. And the same with members of an LLC, they're shielded from liabilities of that entity. But if you're looking at a general partnership or a limited partnership, the general partners are not going to be shielded from liability. So it probably isn't a great option for most people to choose one of those. The LLP and the LLLP, the owners do have liability protection. There are different management structures for these entities. So corporations, you're probably familiar with the management type structure where you have shareholders make certain decisions. They can elect the board of directors, and the board of directors then has the capacity to make certain decisions for the entity, including hiring officers. And then the officers have the ability to make day-to-day decisions for the entity. So this is often considered a kind of a very formalistic type structure. Comparing that to a limited liability company, there's two types of management structures for a limited liability company. One is a member-managed structure, and that's just as it sounds, the members manage the entity. The other one is the manager-managed, where the members would elect managers. And those managers can be either members themselves or they can be third parties. And then the partnership structure, generally the partners will manage the entity. Governance requirements generally are considered the formalities around making decisions in the entity. So for instance, in a corporate structure, you generally have annual shareholder meetings, you have annual board of directors meetings, maybe you have quarterly board of directors meetings. The way those meetings are called need to be called in a certain way and a certain amount of notice given. If there's going to be a special meeting, there needs to be a certain amount of notice that is given to the participants. And then there needs to be a certain number of participants that show up. There needs to be a quorum. And so what I'm getting at is there's a high degree of requirements or formality with respect to a corporation. And the reason why it's important, the reason why I'm talking about it is because if you don't keep up with the formalities of the entity, you can lose your liability protection. So I've seen quite a few times where small businesses, they think that the corporation makes a lot of sense, but they have a hard time keeping up with the formalities. And so they end up subjecting themselves to potentially losing their liability shield. With respect to an LLC and partnership, the governance requirements are pretty low. It doesn't take a lot generally to call a meeting in those situations. Raising capital is, the corporation is probably one of the better vehicles for raising capital, especially if you're going to be raising public funding or if you're going to be seeking money from a venture capitalist. Venture capitalists generally want to see a public company, and that's for a few reasons. One primary reason is Venture capitalists are getting money from a lot of different sources and a lot of different investors. Those investors are foreign individuals. They're non-for-profit entities. And those types of investors will run into tax problems if they're investing into a partnership. So they generally want to see a corporate entity, and that's why venture capitalists will also want to see a corporate structure that they invest into. LLCs and partnerships, they're pretty good for raising capital, but more in the private context. The last attribute that I wanted to touch on is flexibility in allocating income. A corporation has very little flexibility and allocate its income. It has to be allocated basically on share ownership. You can have multiple classes of stock, but within those classes, they have to be allocated pro rata and allocated the same for every shareholder within that class. But LLCs and partnerships, there's a lot of flexibility in how you can allocate income, and that can be important depending on what your business arrangement is. All right, so here are the tax classification options. There's a C corporation, a partnership, S corporation, and then disregarded. We're not going to be talking too much about disregarded entities, but just really quickly, a disregarded entity is an LLC that has only one owner. An LLC that has only one owner does not have its own classification. It basically takes on the classification of its owner. If you form a corporation, you will be treated as, or you'll be classified as a C corporation for tax purposes. And we'll go into exactly what that means in a second, but you don't have a lot of options, really. If you form a corporation, you will be classified as a C corporation. Now you do have the option of electing S corporation status if you meet the ownership requirements and some other requirements related to doing so. Now, if you choose one of these other entities, you have a lot of choice. Like I mentioned, you can choose to be a partnership, you can choose to be an S corporation, you can choose to be a C corporation, or if you have one owner and you're an LLC, you can be disregarded. Let's look at some of the attributes of the tax classification choices. And probably the most important one to consider is whether the entity is considered a flow-through entity or not. Partnerships and LLCs are flow-through, which means that all the income from those entities flow through to the owners and are taxed to the owners. Whereas a C corporation is subject to double tax and sometimes even triple tax. And what I mean by that is the entity itself is subject to tax initially on all the income that it receives. And then after paying its tax, it pays a dividend up to its shareholders. The shareholders are then taxed again on that same income. So it ends up in a double tax. And if you have multiple levels of C corporations, you could actually have even more tax. For that reason, C corporations are not really a great vehicle for business ownership. There are reasons why you would want to, and we'll get into that some more in a second. But to be considered a C corporation, there's not a whole lot of eligibility requirements there that need to be met. You just need one owner. For an S corporation, though, there are eligibility requirements. You can only have 100 shareholders. You can only have one class of stock. And then all the shareholders have to be domestic individuals or certain types of trusts or estates. The next one, partnerships. To be a partnership, you need 2 or more owners, and the entity can't be a corporation. And the only times that you want to me it makes sense to choose a corporation is if you're looking for venture capital money or if you're planning to go public. If you're planning to go public, you will be treated as a corporation no matter what entity you select. So it makes sense just to choose the corporation in that instance. Now you might say, well, we could file an S corporation election and avoid the double taxation. But the reasons why you would form a corporation would make the S corporation election not available. And what I mean by that is to me, you really only form a corporation if you're, like I said, trying to go public or you're trying to obtain venture capital money. And in those instances, the S corporation election is not going to be available. The other potential area where a corporation makes sense is for large organizations. The management structure works very well in large organizations. All right, general partnership. When should you choose this entity? Pretty much never. It's not, it doesn't do you any good. Similar with the limited partnership, you know, for the general partners, they don't receive any liability protection, so why select it? They are useful sometimes in venture capital structures, but I don't think that applies to anybody here. You're not trying to set up a venture capital structure. What about these other entities, the LLC, the LLP, and the LLP? When should you choose those entities? Well, they're all good for liability protection. They have flexible management structure. The governance requirements are low. They're good for raising capital, at least in the private context. And they're flexible from a taxation perspective. So these are all good choices. But by far the most common that I see are limited liability companies, people forming those over any of the other ones. Mainly because of the laws or the statutes and body of case law is a lot more established. For LLCs, they've been around a little bit longer in all 50 states. So it's a good choice. All right, so what state? Is there a certain state that's better than another to set up your business? Anybody have any thoughts, questions? You? Delaware? Delaware has been a very popular place for businesses for a long time, and for a couple reasons. One is they have been known to be very favorable. Their statutes and body of case law has been very favorable to the business as opposed to maybe creditors. The other reason, for a long period of time, there used to be favorable tax reasons. You would set up your IP in Delaware and receive certain favorable tax results from doing that. Those reasons don't exist anymore. So there really aren't tax reasons for setting up in Delaware, but if the state that you're doing business in doesn't have favorable statutes and case law for setting up a business there, then Delaware is a great option for doing that. I would say that North Carolina, if you're doing business in North Carolina I think has pretty comparable statutes and body of case law that is favorable. So to me, I wouldn't hesitate to set up an entity in North Carolina. I mean, I think it's a pretty good choice.